just be aware that it's just switched it on. You've got the opportunity to leave if you wish. So yeah, I'm going to kick off with a bit of an intro. So there's three of us, the two guys in the red, and myself. So Tom and Paul. Tom's got the hoodie on, and Paul is the kind of bearded guy there. And myself, we put together the 2019 event, but I've known these guys I've known Tom for 20 years. So, and Paul probably for a good 10, 11 years now. So good friends, and we came together to put together the 2019 event. And that proved a big success for us. And certainly for me, as somebody who's put together quite a few of the other events, and we decided to do it again for this year. I guess in terms of who we are, I've been running events for 16 years, and as many of you know, I'm kind of bowing out from running events and concentrating on putting on managing open tracking. Paul there, I don't know if you want to introduce yourself, Paul, briefly. What do you do?
Yeah, I work with a company. I have a company called Dirty Events. We organise events of various kinds around the UK. But kind of, my background is very much as a participant. So I've raced a number of James's events and plenty of other people's events as well, including a number of expedition races. I raced ITERA in 2012 and 2014.
Tom, do you want to introduce yourself?
Tom Gibbs. I've been racing now for far too long. I think I started adventure racing about 25 years ago now, and raced around the world. Was lucky enough to be world champion in 2009, and got into race planning because got frustrated doing some races with what they made you do. So I thought I'd get into planning to see if I can correct some of those things and then make some of my own mistakes as well.
So what I'm going to do, we've just got a short agenda of things which we're going to cover for the next sort of kind of 30 to 40 minutes, and then we'll give sort of quarter of an hour, 20 minutes for questions. If there's no questions, then we'll close the session at the end of it. I should say this is not in any way for those which are doing the ITERA. We're not replacing. It's not part of the briefing. It's not essential. You kind of listen to this. It's just an aid to some people to hopefully get a better idea of what goes on. I should also say that you can ask away about questions about this year, but we're zipped about it. In fact, we're going to try our utmost to talk about 2019 and not talk about 2022. I'm gonna, Tom, I think we're kind of making the.
I think everyone's gone actually, James. I think everyone's just gone. Yeah, there's only three of us left now.
We're making the assumption that you guys know about expedition racing in the context of what we're doing here. It's teams of four, generally to be ranked. It's a kind of mixed team of four, and it involves a whole host of disciplines. So we're not going to go through what is expedition racing. We kind of assume that you've got that basis. For what is the ITERA, I suppose coming at it from that perspective. Back in 2010, I was asked by Adidas to put on an expedition race. I was organising some 24-hour races, and some of you, I can see some names here, people who took part in that event, which was in the Lake District. It was a long weekend. In fact, it wasn't a full week. It was a sort of Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Monday thing based out of Keswick. And Adidas, it was a 3-year thing, which came to an end in 2012 with the event which Paul did in Scotland, and Nick Gracie helped me plan that event. And so that arrangement with Adidas came to an end. And I created, alongside the guys who actually run the Kendal Mountain Festival, this brand called ITERA. Really, the format of the event didn't change from going from Adidas Terex. Obviously, Adidas Terex was a brand which Adidas owned. So we created the ITERA. we started that with 2014 with the event through Wales, which Tom helped me put together, which was the length of Wales. And we'll come on to kind of some of the planning aspects of that, but there was definitely difficult questions asked right at the beginning as to whether or not we could actually make this work of getting people going from one end of the country to the other. And if I recall, there was something like 34, 35 teams who stood on the start line, and 30 teams made it to the finish as a complete team. So I think 2 or 3 teams merged. So that gives you an idea of what we're about. So what is the difference between our race and other expedition races? Certainly running events in England and Wales, we have some kind of nuances with racing bikes. And that has kind of perpetuated this kind of more score orienteering style of events in the UK, where people have not necessarily racing head to head. So mass start on bikes, all heading the same direction. It's kind of a bit of a no-no in England and Wales. It's slightly different in Scotland, but certainly in England and Wales. And so this kind of score orienteering style of things is how adventure races are run in this country. We twisted it a little bit with the Terex events in that we created a long course, more of a linear course, but it was optional. And so we kind of, dare I say, we dodged a bullet with the laws of the country, so we didn't make it mandatory. And if you didn't visit a checkpoint, you were short coursed and you would get a time penalty. So if you didn't go to the top of make it simple on Wales. So yeah, Lord Hereford's Knob. Is if you didn't go to the top of Snowdon, then you would get a 4-hour penalty for not getting to the top. And that way we kind of created this kind of short course thing where you would get time penalties for not visiting checkpoints. And that format, and then what we would do is at each of the transitions or significant points around the course, we would then put in cut-offs. And so that would kind of help the event keep moving around at a certain pace. So we would get everybody to the finish line rather than the course closing 4 days later and half the team's only halfway around the course. So that's broadly the principle of what we work with. Tom might come into a little bit more detail about that. But I guess the ethos behind the ITERA is that we are not an event which looks to break teams and to celebrate a low finish rate. That is not us. We're not the Patagonia event or some of the other events which are run around the world. That's not us. We are an event which celebrates a high finish rate. That's what we get excited about. And when things don't work out that way, and dare I say, if we go back to 2019 when we had a few teams pull out, it grates on us, and it's not something which sits well with us. But that's not what we designed. So it is about getting teams around, and these cut-offs to push teams onto the short course is to help them get all the way around. I don't know. I think the other thing to say about it is the transitions which we aim for. We aim to use, and Tom will make fun of me and Paul about this, but we try and use where possible village halls or buildings to run their transitions out of. My thinking behind that is that if we can give teams a place to kind of recover, get their kit sorted out in the dry, perhaps away from those pesky midges, then they'll stand a better chance of completing the next stage. If I've been to events and I've worked on a lot of events which, they run out of green fields, you turn up, it's chucking down rain, it's just a field, you've been out for 24 hours, and you got to empty your bag out in the rain. It's not to say it doesn't happen occasionally on our events, but we don't design our events. We aim to try and find indoor places wherever we can at the end of each stage. And again, that's about trying to facilitate as many teams getting to the end as possible. There's disadvantages with that. I know that the more transitions we put in, in a particular race, the more stoppage time there is, the more people don't move, and there is a danger that people go into these transitions and they get, they focus on their bags and they don't move and they faff and everything else. And actually, the event itself has got to keep moving. It's got to have momentum around it. So getting that timing of how many transitions, where we put them, and what we do with them is really important part of our course design. Yeah, I think that's fair to say. Paul, do you want to cover the next section? I think I've covered my time. I'm a bit ahead, but go for it.
Yeah, that sounds pretty good to me. Yeah, I'll pick up for a couple of minutes. I'll keep this next little section quite brief because it's quite dry, but it's, as James says, it's a bit of a peek behind the curtains is the intention here. So kind of before Tom gets to do his job of planning an amazing course, we kind of have to choose somewhere for this event to be, and that's not a random kind of process. There's a number of factors that are not necessarily very interesting, that we have to kind of take into consideration. And, so what makes a great kind of adventure race location? Clearly we're looking for kind of mountains and kind of wild places and a variety of terrain, and, something that's pretty empty. We don't really want to be racing through city centres, all those kind of things. So that's all fine, but there's a bunch of other stuff we have to do as well. I mean, we have to find venues that are close to those places, but also close enough to kind of civilization, if you like, that you can get there fairly easily, particularly teams that are coming in from overseas. We're trying to find places for race headquarters that you can get to. It's all very well putting stuff, in the kind of, the remote wilderness of Scotland, but, some of those places are hours and hours and hours and hours and hours away, really big distances and really terrible roads. So we're trying to find places that are close-ish to an airport, for example, a decent airport so that teams can get in, which in Scottish terms, that means it's got to be relatively close to kind of Edinburgh, Glasgow, or possibly Inverness, Aberdeen. We're looking for places that have got enough kind of infrastructure in terms of accommodation and restaurants and a venue that we can host the essential functions of the race, both before and after. So, accommodation for the crew and accommodation for racers in the day or two before the race, somewhere decent and chunky and capable that we can host race briefings and the course reveal, all that kind of stuff. And probably the most important thing, where we're going to host the post-race party. So those things are all the factors in our heads when we kind of, when we scout around every couple of years and say, well, where's the next one going to be? Those are the factors that we're playing. So that's why we ended up in Inverness in 2019, airport right there, 3 hours-ish, 2.5 hours-ish by road from Edinburgh, so not terrible. And then access to some amazing terrain. And Tom's going to talk through in a second, I think, about kind of, once we'd settled on Inverness, kind of what came next in terms of the course. But it was that kind of process that also led us to, I'm not going to give anything away, Oban for this year in terms of where the race HQ is going to be. It has accommodation, it has restaurants, it's a great setting right by the sea, and it's not a gazillion miles away from places. It's close-ish to Glasgow Airport, not that far from Edinburgh, and actually there's a train line as well. So Oban makes sense as a race HQ location. So that's kind of how we end up at kind of picking those spaces, and then Tom does his bits. Tom, off to you next.
All right, thanks, Paul. So I guess from my point of view is having done a fair few races, and I get a bit frustrated sometimes in races where you're doing things you don't want to do. The classic one is you're on foot and you think, I should be riding my bike here. That sort of thing. That's kind of got me into sort of thinking, well, I should, sort of do something about it. And I got involved with James about sort of planning races. And I think for me, like James said, I think one of the big things is trying to make a course which is, the short course is doable for all the teams, and then think about how you then stretch the sort of full course teams. Ideally you want an ideal course who's got interest for both and in between as well. And I think, once James and Paul have decided upon which village halls they want to go to, I kind of then look at what
from our
route can link
extensive
them.
database.
Yes, from their extensive database, and there's village halls there that you just never knew existed. But they do get quite excited about village halls and car parks and bus shelters and things like that. Probably unhealthily so. But essentially, I think, I kind of see it as what we're trying to do. And, you've been to races. I mean, I remember when I raced in Tasmania and I was doing this one stage and it was across the middle of this moorland. And you think, why am I not on Table Mountain? I've come all this way. And you kind of expect, especially for the foreign teams, you kind of expect to be shown the best of the local area. And I think that's something that we always try hard to do is, think, for most teams, you're there for a holiday and you want to see some great places and experience it, and get through as much of the course as you can. So I think it's one thing we do try really hard to do is try and come up with a course that's going to sort of inspire and sort of interest people as much as make it challenging. You won't ever see on our banners, this is the toughest race in the world. This is the hardest adventure race. And, like James said, we don't delight in seeing only 3 teams sort of finish the course. What we do delight is seeing as many as possible getting through. So I think what we generally do is sit down and try and work out, what's a great start location, somewhere that's going to inspire, and then really just trying to pull that course together. And I always find there's a good tension between myself and James and Paul around, the logistics to support that course versus the experience for the competitor. Because sometimes as a competitor, you'll be doing stuff and it's probably, you wouldn't outside of it be doing that, maybe that discipline, maybe you have got to run along some tracks. But, you might find that because of the logistics, if you at least understand, I could see why they had to do that, then that's kind of, in a way, that's kind of okay, if you know what I mean. But I think from our point of view, it's about getting that experience for people. So looking at what won the maps, get the maps out, look at, right, what's going to be a really cracking stage. How do we best deliver that in terms of being able to support logistics, get kit round, all that sort of stuff, whilst also, trying to minimize anything that doesn't feel like a great experience. And I think if people come off it and say, well, I'd go and do that stage again, then that's kind of, they'll come back after the race and go there. That was an amazing place. That's kind of like, for me, that's a really inspirational thing. And that's what I'm trying to achieve. I think all the races, with the front end, people, getting through the course is going to be hard. It's not going to be easy, but we don't have to make it unnecessarily hard, or we don't have to aim for the hardness. I think the top teams, they're then pushing each other. They're going to make it hard for each other and they're going to be suffering, but that's kind of their choice rather than necessarily how we've designed the course.
Tom, I've got the screenshot if you want me to share it at any point of the.
Yeah, that's a good idea. Yes.
Do you want me to share that? See if I can share that now.
Yep. Yeah.
Hopefully that's coming in. You got that?
Yes. I assume everybody can see that. This was the course we did in 2019, and I know James and I spent quite a lot of time and going to look for start venues for this. We started off at I quite like my distilleries. James isn't a fan, but I like my distilleries. So there usually is a distillery involved if we're in Scotland. It's what it's famous. One of the things it's famous for. So when we started off here, we kind of knew we starting in Inverness. We kind of thought it'd be a good place to finish because you've got all your facilities nearby. And we looked at a couple of distilleries, James. We spent a good sort of day or two, trying to work out. We had a few options. In fact, the transition after the first paddle at Glenmorangie Distillery, that was a potential start place. And then we kind of saw Dunrobin Castle, and we knew that was the spot. It's a stunning castle, and that's one thing Britain's got in spades, isn't it? It's history, it's castles, and Scotland's got all its distilleries. It's sort of bringing in those aspects. So that kind of sort of set our start point, and that paddle. And then it's about, just trying to work out a good journey for people, really. And that first bike leg, certainly that first area for the first mountains, was some great cycling up there, out to the other coast. And another aspect we did about this here, we crossed Scotland, from the the east to the west and then back again in this race. I know we had a few sort of, the weather didn't help us, and the sort of restrictions we had from our sort of our kayak safety guide kind of didn't help us, and we've learned from that going forwards into this next race. You know, and I think we spent more time on 2022 talking about the sort of risk mitigation and what happens if the weather's bad here, what happens if it's bad there, what can we play around with. And I think we're probably more confident of having success this time than probably where we were in 2019, where we didn't quite approach it as well as we have this time. But that was an epic stage for the Summer Isles, with Silver. And it's something I've always wanted to do in a race, is try and combine a sort of a through trip in the kayak with climbing some mountains and some route choice in the kayaks as well. Then we had sort of Fisherfield, which is a real wild place, and Shellac's an amazing mountain. And that was kind of an area we wanted to try and explore. And try and put in a sort of more of an expedition-y like sort of foot stage there. And, you're proper in the middle of nowhere. It's got the most remote Munro in Scotland in the middle there. So it was kind of, an obvious place to try and put a foot stage. Anyone who did the event know that we had to sort of adjust the course here a bit. And that's one thing we do in ITERA, is we kind of design the course so we've got options to be able to, if the weather's bad and people are behind where we think they should be, we can sort of contract the course if necessary. Or, if people are actually ahead of schedule, we can expand it. I don't think we've ever done that though, James, have we? I think it's always behind if it's going to be anything. People just need to go a bit quicker. So we had a mountain bike through Torridon and then Leartach, and because of the big foot stage and the paddle had taken quite a lot out of people, we decided to withdraw Leartach, which was a shame. But we kept in the sort of the mountain bike across Applecross, which was a pretty amazing a ride across there. And then back over the sort of one of the biggest passes in the country across the Bilach Bar, which is another thing, we want to try and get some distant terrain and some different experience. And I think, a lot of time going across some of these areas, certainly on bike, you can move people from A to B. I remember one race I did in Norway and Sweden where they very much did that. They had their sort of signature stages, and then the bike was almost like the sort of transfer in between. And that kind of works well for an adventure race. Not every stage has to be super hard. Not every stage has to be sort of technically demanding. It's about sort of getting people through the course and giving that experience. And then we had like the Five Sisters trek, and then the paddle on Glengarry, which I have to say was one of James's ideas to get us across a bit further across. Originally, we were thinking of going into Glen Affric and then coming back across. We kind of didn't want to do the paddle on Loch Ness because that's a bit of a sort of, other races have done that. And frankly, once you start paddling down a loch after a few minutes, it's kind of, you kind of, it loses interest, and that's 20 odd miles of paddling in a straight line. It's kind of not maybe the most interesting. So we looked at doing this paddle down that river in Glengarry, and we arranged to have the sort of dam release for the rafting that we put in there. So I think James can probably take the credit for most of that section. And I think that's where it works quite well with the three of us, that we tend to have different sort of eyes, different ways of looking at bits, and it kind of comes together quite well. And then we finished off with a sort of pretty straightforward mountain bike along the Great Glen, which I think people actually really enjoyed. They had there's some good cycling on there. It's never too super rough, and you're not pushing your bike particularly much, but there's some good sort of single track and some good trails. So it kind of brought people in a bit of a high. So that was kind of, I think we probably went through quite a few iterations here, didn't we, James? I mean, originally our plan on sort of that paddle was to come into Ullapool rather than crossing across that channel, just where it says Summer Isles, if you can see on the map. And then we were going to go to the Corrie Gorge, and we spent 6 months trying to get arranged with the National Trust and the locals being able to abseil off the bridge. And if anybody has been there, that would have been a 100-meter free-sided abseil just straight down. and then down a gorge, it would have been amazing. But just getting the access just proved too difficult.
We came really, really close to that. I mean, a lot of resistance from this is the kind of thing that we are doing in the background all the time. Some of it pays off, some of it doesn't, but it's always worth a go. And Corrie Shalach was one of those kind of moonshots that we thought was worth a go, because it is, as Tom says, it's this incredible kind of letterbox gorge. It's 100 meters deep and 10 meters wide, and no one, I mean, like single figures of people have ever been in the bottom of it. And we were achingly close to getting permission to do that. So you'd have abseiled down. That's the kind of thing we're looking for. I think, as Tom said a few times now, we're looking for the highlights and then trying to achieve them. And ITERA is a big enough event that we've got the ability to pull off some of these kind of pretty special things.
And I think, looking ahead to this year, I think we've learned from our mistakes. Every time we do these races, you learn from them, and then, you try and improve the course. And I think we have this time. I think it looks an absolutely superb course. I'm, looking forward to sharing it with people. Obviously, you can't do that right this moment, which will disappoint Gary on the call. But
you need to.
Tom, I was going to say, do you want to? How do you work out timings? How do you know? I know the answers because you are an Excel geek. You've had a pop at me about Village Hall, so I think I'm allowed to have a go at you about Excel. So
I don't do Excel anymore. I got people.
How do you work out? How do you know how long that a course is going to take?
Well, obviously in 2019 didn't do a very good job of that, but I think we've always sort of looked back at the previous events and seen how fast people move on different terrain. And I mean, Wales, we got pretty bang on actually. So it's kind of looking at the the distances and the climb and the sort of terrain and coming out with time estimates. And probably easier for the front of the field than it is some of the slower teams, because there's things for the slow teams, sort of it's hard to predict how long someone's going to spend in transition, for example, or making navigational errors, which the sort of more less experienced teams tend to make more of those. So it's we kind of focus on three things really. We focus on the sort of fastest short course team, the slowest short course team, and the sort of the fastest teams overall. And we've always got an eye on trying to get sort of up to sort of the top 10 through the full course. So they're kind of things we kind of look at. Yes, thanks, Gary. You may not be doing that this time, though. We might put a special stage in for Endurance Life, special boat dragging stage just for you. Yeah, so it's trying to get that sort of the balance of, hello, Gary, get the balance of the sort of the times and the timings for the different courses, and I think we've tried to do that. And it's also, some people probably wonder how we do things like come up with how much it is to time penalties, etc. And it, I think James, when you first started doing these, it was kind of, you worked quite hard on trying to get it balanced with the sort of time it took to go there and stuff like that. And I think we've taken a different approach over the years, where we tend to load it on the stuff that's fun. So if there's stuff we want you to do, it'll have a high penalty for missing it. So if you've got abseils or canyoneering or something like that, that'll have a higher score penalty to it than another mountain or a bit more biking, for example, or more paddling. So we tend to look at it more around trying to encourage people to do certain bits of the course, and that's worth bearing in mind when you're doing the event in August, is thinking about, if there's a really low penalty to something and it looks a long way, there might be a reason why we've done that. It might be trying to suggest if you don't think you're going to do the full course, that might be a bit to avoid and not do. Obviously for full course teams, you're going to have to just go and do it all. So I don't know if there's anything else, James, on.
No, I think we could probably move on and then come back to questions at the end. Is that okay? So I've got down sort of recce trips and what we do on the recce trips. I think first thing to say just a bit about ourselves, the way which we manage the ITERA, is that we probably only met up twice before each event as a three at a couple of service stations. So we don't tend to go and recce things as a three. It will be Tom and Paul, or me and Paul, me and Tom, and we'll take it in turns. We'll probably do about 5 trips before the event, and each trip will have a bit of a different focus on it. So the initial trips are normally, say, between me and Paul, to look at the key venues like Inverness or Oban, to try and establish relationships with local venues, big venues, to make sure, you know, with somewhere like Inverness or Oban, we know that there's probably a couple of events we could run out of that place. So we don't necessarily have to have it all buttoned down before we actually find it, but we do need to get the big venues booked. And as I found out to my cost, with Daniel O'Donnell in 2016 on Ireland, when I had to move the ITERA in Ireland because Daniel O'Donnell was turning up. You have to get these things booked in before anybody else. And then subsequent ones, I think we're often drawing on our own experience of being in those places. And then we do tend to focus on those kind of special stages. And the paddling, Paul Noble very wisely said to me once, find the water and then make the event. So you know, a lot of these events are designed around what the paddle stages will be, because of the way which we're going to do with either moving the boats or because we've got water safety cover, those kind of things. So once we've got a few of those things into place, generally I'll go up with Tom. Tom will paddle some of those sections or go and mountain bike some of those sections. And then, you know, if I look back at both next year's event, but also 2019, I can think of a number of, you know, Tom probably cycled 100, 200 kilometers on tracks which never ever got used, and came back and just said that's just not going to work. Some, obviously, clearly, if there's places which we've not been to before, then we'll go and check those out and just make sure they're, you know, they're workable. There's, without question, we don't go everywhere where everybody goes. You know, there's open route choice on a lot of these events, and we don't see it all the time. We don't see that a team would take that route. But, you know, on the whole, we do, certainly the short courses, we want to make sure we've got that button down, and we're not going to get people dragging bikes through a forest. It's just not our style. So the recce trips, I think, are key to us, especially with us not living up there, to go and meet the local people. And occasionally I bump into a racer. So if we've bumped into one of you, you just have to pretend you haven't seen us, or we'll show you a dodgy line about what we're up there for. But yeah, that's an important part of what we do. And to be honest, you know, for the next year, obviously we had it planned for 2020. You know, we're already there. Most of the work which we've done recently has just been picking up the phone and reconfirming next year's arrangements. What have I got onto here next? Selection of venues and TAs. We kind of mentioned there, really, just the venues. Again, we're trying to find somewhere which we can get people inside. We've got to be able to move a lot of kit. So, you know, parking a lot of vehicles. That does become a bit of a focus. Reality is there's also a really important bit where we're actually looking at how fast will teams move between a particular place, and can we actually physically shift that kit in that time? You know, we've got a team of volunteers. We don't want to break them. That's when mistakes start getting made. It's fine for a team to make a mistake, but we've got people driving vehicles. So we don't want to kind of run everybody at, you know, 99% of their capacity. We want to kind of back it off a little bit. And so that really does come into the course design, is kind of, can we get those bikes, from one transition to another transition whilst they're out there on foot? And occasionally we have to put caveats in the route book to say that, you know, your bikes will leave and be at the next transition, I know, within 8 hours or something like that, just to kind of caveat that for the short course teams, because it's just not possible to do any other way. So that very much comes into our heads. I think, is there anything else you had in mind for that? I think we're going to run out of time if we're not careful. So I think I'll probably pass back to Paul, actually.
Cool. Yeah, I'll just be really quick on this section as well, because I seem to be getting all the really boring ones, which is kind of pretty much what I do on this event. So we do genuinely try and speak to all of the landowners. I mean, we've got these incredible access laws in Scotland that allow us a pretty kind of free rein in terms of what we do. However, we're not in the business of taking risks with that. I mean, yes, we've got a right for responsible access, but at the same time, we don't want nasty surprises. We don't want teams encountering landowners who don't know anything about what's going on and are asking awkward questions, or encountering forestry works that are dangerous to pass or anything like that. So we do actually spend quite a lot of time trying to track down the landowners. And I'm not going to guarantee that we get that 100% right, because you can imagine on a course of 500, 600 kilometers, that's quite a task. And there isn't really a central repository of who owns what in Scotland. What data there is quite old. So we kind of tend to operate on the basis of we'll line up one permission, and then, well, who's your next door neighbour? Who's your next door neighbour? Who's your next door neighbour? And we work our way down the line. But I mean, we count the landowners in, I mean, I wouldn't like to guess, but I'm going to anyway. It's probably 100 to 150 this year, something like that, folks that we've got to approach. And that's really still only at the kind of the scale of estates and farms and things like that. But we do try and do that. We also speak to community organisations as best we can, and people like the Coast Guard and the RNLI and Mountain Rescue. This is quite hard, particularly community organisations, because they have a habit of minuting meetings and publishing them. And we know that you're all quite sneaky, and that you will quite happily scour the internet for any trace that we've been around the place. We know we've come across that. So we kind of almost have to swear the communities that we're working in to secrecy as well. Unfortunately, they think it's great fun by and large, and are more than happy to go along with us and go to the most incredible kind of Cold War style extremes in order to keep things nice and quiet. But we do try and tip them off, because again, 3 o'clock in the morning, passing through a village, we don't want angry people. We want people that kind of know something about what's going on. And then there's a whole bunch of suppliers and contractors and lots and lots of people that are involved. And some of those are the boring stuff like toilets and trucks. Some of them are the more interesting. Tom mentioned one of them. So for the Glengarry paddle in 2019, we were dealing with Scottish Water to make sure that the dam was opened at the right time for the race, so there was enough water for the whitewater rafting stage. There isn't normal. If you'd have been back, if you'd have been in that place 3 hours before the race passed and 3 hours after the race passed, there wouldn't have been enough water in there. That wasn't an accident. We deliberately arranged for the dam to be released. Again, it's a kind of an example of the kind of things that ITERA can do that quite a lot of other things can't. I think that's probably all I should say.
Yeah,
on that.
I'm going to skip a few sections because I'm keen that we have some time at the end. If it's all right, guys, I'm just going to cover a little bit on our changes and contingency planning. So I'm just going to miss a step there, if it's all right, Paul. So we've still got 15 minutes for questions. So we designed the event for the long course teams, and as Tom mentioned, ideally up to 10 teams can get around the long course. And then we have this window of when the teams can finish, and it's generally about 24 hours. We try and make that a bit longer each time we run the event, but it can be difficult. Obviously, there's a danger that the first team finishes and then it's 2 days before the prize giving. So we have this tension there, and it's very difficult. Although Tom's got this amazing spreadsheet to kind of predict some of these times, and particularly with the weather, can easily affect some of the stages by 20% of the times. And so we design the event as such, in that the ideal conditions for the fastest team, the best teams in the world, could come along and get round in this particular time. And so we deliberately make the course just a little bit too long, and as such, we've got a schedule which we put together before the event, that if teams don't reach this point by this particular time, then we will take that checkpoint out. This is a really important part of what we do. Is we design the event that way. We will endeavour to give every team more than a stage notice if we're going to shorten the course, so that they can plan that strategically. But we need to do that so that we can make sure that we get all of the teams finishing in that 24-hour window. It's not a fault of the course. I've had a few people say, well, you messed up because you had to shorten the course. That is deliberate. That's how we've done it. Clearly, there's sometimes it catches us sideways. We weren't expecting that. We weren't expecting something to take a lot longer, and we've had to shorten bits of it. But on the whole, that's how we deliberately manage that. And as such, there's particular points during the event, particularly after the first 24 hours, when we'll make strategic decisions about what will happen on day 3, within the, probably at the end of the first 24 hours, we can make a call as to whether or not we need to shorten a section of course for the long course teams. Generally, the short course teams are already on the shortest course anyhow, unless we start lobbing big chunks of it out.
I think, James, it's worth also saying there, that I think for 2022, one thing we learned from 2019 was to have sort of more rigorous sort of cut-offs, and and with those cut-offs, generally what we tend to have is quite a sort of large, weighty penalty. So, it kind of focuses the teams on making sure they get through the course in a decent length of time. And what we've allowed is a decent amount of time to get through stages. So it's really for teams who are sort of sticking on a full course when they shouldn't do, and they're a day behind everyone else sort of cut-offs, just to keep the field together, because that helps obviously with the logistics and all those issues of, you've only got a certain number of marshals and a certain number of logistics, and it's trying to keep the race reasonably compact. But we spent quite a lot of time in 2022 looking at getting the balance right with cut-offs and penalties if you miss a cut-off, etc.
Those cut-offs are really about this kind of overriding concern that we've got of getting as many teams as we possibly can to the finish line. That's what they're really about.
And none of our cut-offs are you're going to be put in a van and taken to the finish. So it's
it normally is if you miss this cut-off, you'll have to go straight to the next transition, rather than completing the next stage. So you'll have to get on a bike and you'll have to cycle along the minor roads to the next transition. So I'm going to we've got another 15 minutes, and I really wanted to give a bit of a chance for questions. You're welcome either to unmute if you've got a particular question, or post it in the chat box.
Probably easiest, because we've got 40 odd people in the room. If you've got a question, stick it on the chat.
Yeah,
there's one there already.
Okay, which one's that? Sorry, about dragons.
The stuff about dragons, and I presume that's a Welsh spelling as opposed to Gary spilling coffee on his keyboard. There's a question there about, are there things that are too extreme for us? Are there things that we won't include because they're too extreme?
Road running.
Actually, I think, the answer to that is yes, but it's perhaps
it's got to be, yeah.
The answer to that is, clearly, there's bits of rock in even in Scotland. There are bits of rock that are, that are pretty extreme. We're not going to take teams on day 4 up something really extreme, that requires proper pucker rock skills. That's not going to happen.
Yeah, for me, there's 2 things which come into it. One is that we are taking 200 people over a particular stage, and as such, whilst some of those stages might be able to tolerate 1 or 2 people, the question is, can they tolerate 200 people going through that? And so things like rockfall and stuff like that, obviously if you've got a lot more people around, if you're on your own or you're with a few people and you knock a rock, it's maybe not such a big deal. But if we've got a lot of teams there, then that can turn into quite a big issue. So I think that tends to be where our focus is. I think the other thing is, that it might sound a bit odd, but I'm not a great fan of including stages, particularly special stages, where there's a game of chance, if that makes sense. And so I mean, I think there's fun to add the archery and things like that, but I think it just adds a degree of, you need a level of skill, and unless we've told you about those skills before you've got to the event, I think it's just a bit unfair. So yeah, the other thing is, I think there's a responsibility of us to kind of make sure that you're aware of the risks which you could engage with. And obviously we want that element of surprise in terms of the terrain. But if we're going to, I know on some events overseas, they sent people across glaciers. And so in those situations, you would expect to know about glacier travel before you turned up to the event. We've had it on some events where we've put rope skills and there's a level of expectancy that you'll have a certain competency and ropes. And that, whilst we may or may not have that in these events, we've counteracted that with having staff there. So we've not got that there. So it is an event management point of view where we clearly will risk assess staff and make sure we get it right, but it's not risk free.
I think we can confidently say we're not going to put anybody on any glaciers in Scotland.
Yeah, no. Yeah.
Or deserts. You're not going on any deserts. You don't need any desert equipment.
How
it won't be hot.
The questions come in: how many international teams are registered? It's about a third. So I think it's about 15 teams we've got registered at the moment. So I'd have to go and double check, but normally, yeah, it's about that. It's normally about 20, 25 UK teams, 15 international teams. I'd have to go back and check. Yeah. Any other questions? Am I missing any here? No, they're all gone quiet.
So we could either encourage more questions, got a couple of minutes, or perhaps revisit a couple of the sections that we skipped over, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, I can.
I've got a question for you, James. So what makes a good village hall?
Oh, you pick off. Parking, mate. Good bit parking. Nice view.
Internet.
Internet.
Will there be whiskey? Not spelled with an E, there won't.
Yeah, no, you're wrong. Wrong part of the world if it's got an E in it, apparently.
Yeah.
There's a distillery in Oban. Does that answer the question?
Yeah,
there is a very good distillery in Oban called the Oban Distillery. But yes, see, there more than likely will be whiskey involved.
Yeah, there will be. Yeah, yeah. Thanks for this session. We know in advance if there are any TAs where will be mandated rest periods to plan to sleep? We're not intending on making you sleep anywhere. That's certainly that's been the case in a number of events around the world, but we don't have a kind of like a 4-hour enforced sleep. That's not something which we've decided to do. We don't tend to have that problem. I mean, on this year's events, I mean, again, I don't want to give away too much, but I would say about most of the transitions have somewhere where you can get, well, I don't know, about half of them, I suppose there might be places to get your head down. So yeah, it'll be all clear in the route book. Can you talk about the role of the race referee? That's an interesting one. Last year, or 2019, we had Adrian Crane along to be the race referee, an honorary, well, he is from Britain actually, but he lives over in California. He is the head Venture Racing World Series referee. I have to admit, I was very skeptical. I didn't really want somebody coming on board telling us how to run the event, and actually it proved a great success. So they basically take the World Series rules, which is worth sort of kind of checking up on, and apply them to our event. We add some smaller ones in, some extra bits of kit, which we ask you to carry. And then obviously we've got our own route book, you know, with cut-offs and you're not allowed to do this or not allowed to do that. And the race referee will generally be the one which enforces those rules. I have to say, people who come along to our events pay good money not to be told off. And we take very much an attitude that you're here to have fun and to enjoy the journey, and not to, feel as if you're back at school. We often turn the question back on ourselves: did we communicate clearly as to what the rules were? And we try and keep the number of rules down to a minimum, so it's very clear, particularly for those which are not English speaking. So you haven't got a massive book of rules, but also we just want to apply them fairly. And really, we see the judge of what we do as not being the team which has committed the offence, but the rest of the teams on the event. What would they expect us to do in this situation? But I'd like to think that we don't dish them out that often, and we try and avoid it where possible.
And it's probably more important for the sharp end of the course as well, isn't it? I've done events where you've had the marshals have been really sort of standoffish with all the teams, and but by the end of the first day, the first 5 teams are racing for the sort of generally racing, and everybody else is kind of just different degrees of surviving, really, and it's kind of trying to help people through.
Yeah, I mean, Tom's right, and we will be harder on those top teams. And we expect those top teams to know what they're doing. And if they're trying to play a game of dropping kit, to travel lighter, to move faster, then they could easily find themselves being disqualified. That kind of approach. So if you're in that top 10, then expect the race referee to be all over you. And just to kind of be clear, there's no point in getting hacked off with any of our marshals or race referee if they ask you to unpack your bag just before you leave transition. That will probably happen at some point or other. So there's no point in doing it. How do you arrange medical cover for such a far-ranging race? So I don't know if Charlotte's on here, actually. She might be lurking. She's our event doctor, and she's worked with me for 12 years, something like that. And she's, we've had a lot of experience of managing these kind of events over the years. I would say that our approach is pretty much hands off. We have taken the approach with the events which we run that people wherever possible should look after themselves and should manage their own blisters and their own minor injuries, and as a team you should look after each other. So you won't find a first aid tent at our transition with somebody ready to patch you up. That's just not kind of how we work, and our experience has shown that when we put the onus on the participants to look after themselves or the team, is that they tend to be a lot more proactive with keeping themselves put together, and more likely to kind of fix blisters on the field rather than wait until they get too late, until they get to transition. We will have medical cover, but it's not blue lights and people with yellow jackets lurking around all over the place. It tends to be a little bit more discreet than that. So it is there. And to be fair, we're not afraid to call the mountain rescue team if we believe that's beyond the equipment and the skills which we've got in-house. So we haven't had to do that on these events. We had the RNLI called out on one event because they mistook one of our participants for something, but we try and avoid that as much as possible.
James, there was a question about logistics, about bags. Okay. Just slightly further up on the chat.
Okay, so previously we had bags A, D to E, but it seems to be a bag each. Expecting has it work, and thanks for putting on. We've got fun. So I think I'd have to go back to what we've got planned for this year. Yeah, generally speaking, we'll have team bags, and then we'll have personal bags, and then we'll have bike boxes, and then we'll have wet bags. There's just some places where we're going to put you in a boat, and really there's just, you just don't want to stop there, and logistically it makes sense for us to just supply your wet bag. And it's the same with the bike box. There's a few places where having your personal bags there and your team bags there just doesn't make sense. We'll just provide your bike box at that location. But we are constantly looking at that to make sure that we've got it right. Today, we have never not got a bag or a bike box in time for a team arriving at a transition. We've never missed out on that. I recognise that if we did that, then that could wreck people's races, and so we put a lot of time to getting that right. But it'll be very clear.
Firstly, James, if people decide they're going to do the short course and they're a team who should be doing the long course and they're very fast, then they have to accept, that we have that rule, don't we, of you can't leave transition until the first full course comes in. So you also have to respect the fact that that if you are doing something like that, then the bag may not be there when you get there.
Yeah, and that happened in 2010. We had an elite team, a very fast team, take on the 2010 Terex, and pretty much raced for less than 50% of the event time. They literally just bolted on the short course from one transition to another. But our way of basically preventing those teams from leaving until a full course team been through kept it together. But it did mean that when they arrived at those transitions, their bags were often not there. So yeah. Is there any more questions? We're coming up to 28 minutes past.
There was one we missed, which we may or may not choose to answer, and that was about, are there going to be animals involved? It's definitely going to be midges.
Haggis, midges.
Yeah.
There's always haggis and midges, isn't there? There might be deer, there may not be.
Big cattle up there with those horns.
Yeah.
That's definitely one or two of them.
There might be sheep. Human beings.
I don't think that's what Colin was driving us, but that's what you're going to get from us.
Yeah.
Porpoise, dolphin, maybe.
Yeah.
Lucky.
I think the one which obviously comes up is midges.
You're not in Yorkshire, Colin. That's all I can say.
Yeah.
Animals or Wales. Animals are required to ride. We don't do that sort of thing. We're a family show. So.
Midges is probably the one. If you've not been to Scotland, generally the things which I advise people is either you need to move faster than 6 kilometers an hour, or you need to take up smoking. They both will solve the problem. But seriously, it's worth just making sure that you've got midge repellent, and don't let it get to you. Keep
Smidge
moving.
works well.
Smidge works well, really well.
And midge has been invented by Paul and James to make you get faster in transitions. So. Yeah. See it as a blessing.
Yeah,
we import truckloads, particularly, especially for the task. Yeah,
exactly. Okay, guys, we're 8:30 in true open adventure style. We hit the time on the dot, as you will find out when you get to the events. We'll start on time, and briefings will be on time. So I hope you've found that informative. We'll be back again, I think, in a week's time with another session. Hope it's useful. If you've got any more questions, then feel free to pop us an email and we'll try and answer them. But we will deliberately avoid any specific questions around this year's event. So don't try and get us too caught up with that. I hope it's useful. Thank you. I'll leave the chat box open. So,
Thank you for your time, folks.
All good.
Thanks, everybody.